Alright, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video here on the channel, and man, today we get to talk about World War III, okay? Is it possible? Is it coming? You guys probably have heard some of the news, at least, about Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, NATO, the United States. What's gonna be the response? Is this the beginning of World War III? What's gonna happen? And yeah, that's basically what we're gonna be talking about in this video. I've been kind of, letting the events kind of play out, so I don't have to make 7 videos on this subject. Obviously, that would benefit me to do, but personally, man, I don't like talking about this kind of stuff for like 8 straight videos. So over the last few months, there's been this massive worry that Ukraine is about to suffer a full-on invasion from Russia, similar at least to what happened in 2014 in the region of Crimea and southern Ukraine, where Russia invaded and took control of it, deeming it as their territory and in the best Russian interests to hold it and whatnot. And right now, about 100,000 of Russia's troops and their military equipment and units have been built up on the border against Ukraine. They've been commencing these massive military drills, and the indication right now is that an invasion could be imminent at any moment, basically, into Ukraine. Multiple nations, including the United States, South Korea, and Japan, have all told their citizens in Ukraine to basically get the fuck out because, well, anything could happen anytime now. The Russians could invade without any sort of notice, and if you're stuck in Ukraine, you're stuck in Ukraine. President Biden has made it very, very clear that we are not going to be putting U.S. troops in Ukraine for any sort of rescue missions for any U.S. citizens. There have been multiple warnings up until this point to get out of Ukraine. The news has been going on for months that the Ukraine could be invaded, basically, and it's gotten to the point that the U.S. government's official response on this is, well, if you get stuck there, it's kind of your fault at this point. We're not coming to rescue you. And of course, if Ukraine is invaded by Russia, it is going to lead to a war. The country of Ukraine, a lot of people wouldn't know, they actually have a very sizable and a very capable military. Russia, of course, is one of the leading military forces on the planet as well. They definitely outnumber the Ukrainians. I think their technology is probably also a little bit more sophisticated than the Ukrainians, but Ukraine is not a pushover country, and even if they do lose any sort of invasion, they are going to make a stand, and I think that they will be able to defend themselves at least somewhat in the potential that an invasion is to come. At this point, I would put my money on the fact that an invasion is going to happen personally, because everything that's kind of happening on the ground kind of indicates that, right? Russia's formal kind of response to this is when it comes to the diplomacy, chatting with Biden and with other European leaders and NATO leaders and whatnot, they seem to kind of act as if like, oh, we're only going to fight if we're attacked first. We're not planning on invading Ukraine. We're allowed to move our military through our borders however we please. If we want to put them right on the border, we're allowed to. But of course, when you're stacking up, 100,000 troops and a bunch of military equipment and tanks and everything that all indicate that you're ready to push over the border and start invading, that would be seen as a problem, right? So you might be wondering, why is Russia even going to invade Ukraine in the first place? What's kind of led to all of this? What's going on? What's the backstory? So first and foremost, Russia, they kind of look back to the glory days of the USSR in a lot of ways, which is when a lot of the Baltic nations and the countries around Russia itself were actually part of the Soviet Union and were communist leaning, and they actually created kind of like a buffer zone against Russia and NATO, which is obviously the United States, Canada, and most of Europe and whatnot's military alliance, what you would call the West. But now that the USSR collapsed about 30 years ago, a lot of these countries are now independent nations, and they have their own political, unfoldings happening. And there's a lot of worry that Ukraine will be joining NATO, which would mean that Russia would be officially bordered by the military alliance that is basically their number one enemy and priority, which from, a neutral standpoint, you can understand why Russia would be worried about that. I mean, as an American, can you imagine if the Chinese, Mexico, Canada, and all of Central America formed an alliance and they were putting, incredible pressure against the borders and they could basically invade at any time or fight us at any time right on our own front? Americans would be going fucking ballistic. But at the end of the day, what Russia's doing is warmongering. What they're doing is destabilizing an entire region, and it's potentially leading to a global conflict that is in nobody's best interest. Because if we're being honest, NATO is much stronger than Russia. And if the United States got formally involved, you're talking about the world's global top military power at that point. It's debatable on whether or not Russia alone could even handle the United States alone. And then when you involve, a lot of the other global military forces in NATO, it could lead to a conflict. And Putin even said publicly that he would not rule out the usage of nuclear weapons in any sort of combat like that. At the same time, though, the United States has maintained the stance that we will not be putting troops on the ground to fight this war for Ukraine. Ukraine. So I guess at the moment we don't have to worry about the idea of Russia and the United States going to war tomorrow, but I find it very hard to believe that the United States would not be fighting a proxy war in Ukraine by supplying them, which they've already been doing, supplying their military, training them, which we've already been doing, and training mercenaries and whatnot to fight alongside them. And if it got bad enough, I can see NATO officially going into the fight, but as of right now, that doesn't seem to be what's going on. The West is kind of on this point of de-escalation. They're trying to talk to Putin and Russian officials and see what can be done to avoid any sort of military conflict. The Russians seem pretty hell-bent on doing this, though. They seem pretty hell-bent on keeping military power on the table for this whole thing here. So at this point, an invasion could be imminent, and in fact, the United States believes that Tuesday of next week, at the earliest, is when any sort of window for Russian invasion will begin, meaning that we could be literally days away from this kind of conflict. Now, personally, I have some mixed feelings on the subject. First and foremost, I'm kind of glad that we're not jumping into this war to fight it on behalf of Ukraine. The United States has kind of had a history of jumping at everyone else's conflicts and fighting them for these people and stuff, and we don't need to do that. You know, it doesn't have to be that way every time. I understand, you know, Russia, what they're doing is warmongering, and it's not a global benefit to anyone, really, but I don't see why 50,000 Americans should have to go and immediately die in this conflict, right? It's about time that we stayed out of one of these, okay? But at the same time, you know, what if Russia continues this? What if, you know, Ukraine's not the end of it? What if they keep pushing and they start taking more countries like this and start legitimately trying to conquer these countries, right? What if Ukraine isn't the end of it? And you know, a lot of people say, oh, that's what they want is just Ukraine. They think that they own Ukraine or whatever, but honestly, how many times in history has a country just started invading its neighbors like this and just only stopped at one, right? I mean, even back at the beginning of World War II, like the Nazis, they started invading all of their neighboring countries one by one and basically conquering them until it got to a point where something had to be done, right? What if that's what happens here? What ends up happening? What's the game plan here, right? Right now, the United States, their formal response to this is, alongside their Western allies in Europe, like the UK, France, Germany, other countries as well, is to impose extremely harsh restrictions on the Russian economy, on Russian billionaires, and on Vladimir Putin himself. These sanctions would cripple the Russian economy, and people, I don't think, really understand how harsh sanctions can actually be, especially from the United States. You know, a lot of Americans view, and a lot of people around the world view, America as a declining state, right? A declining power, but America really does have so much of a stranglehold over so much global impact, right? By far the strongest military, the dominant economic power on the planet still. A lot of the official transactions globally use the US dollar. The US dollar is pretty much like the dominant global currency. A lot of countries use their currency's backups as the US dollar. And so if through the US dollar, through the US economy, your country's being massively sanctioned like that, it does have a lot of economic impact. I mean, you can literally just look at Iran, right? Like Iran, they started the whole nuclear testing or whatever, and America started sanctioning the fuck out of them. It actually crippled their economy. And sure, Iran, whatever you want to call it, they don't have the same economic situation as Russia. You know, Russia is a much larger country with a lot more influence, but it's not like this wouldn't hurt their economy and do a lot to them. These sanctions will and can work. I don't know if it's still enough of a deterrent for Vladimir Putin himself and for his military officials, but it will be very damaging. I mean, it's very hard to lead some sort of offensive front in war like this when, you know, your economy is getting thrashed. People back home are going to be complaining about this and bitching, and rightfully so, right? Because they're the ones who get affected through the entire thing. But people are worried that this has the potential to become World War III. I think if the United States kind of stays out of it, at least up until a point where they kind of have no choice but to get involved, World War III is pretty avoidable, right? Because at the end of the day, the United States has other things to worry about too, right? Like China at any time could also invade Taiwan across the South China Sea, and that could start World War III. And I think that is a situation where American forces would be sent on the ground, and America would be there fighting that war. And from my understanding, Russia and China are kind of on the same page on this Ukraine thing, right? China seems to support this kind of behavior. But of course, you know, Russia is one of their allies. You know, they work together because they're both viewed negatively by the West. And they're both also massive countries with huge global influence. So it makes sense that they would be in agreement on this thing and that they'd be, you know, kind of cooperating in a way, right? Russia is accusing the United States of creating disinformation campaigns to basically justify getting into a conflict with Russia through this whole thing, because because the United States, of course, like they said, Tuesday at the earliest is when they expect a Russian invasion. They're telling US citizens to get out of Ukraine and stuff like that. But of course, the United States also accused Russia of staging false flag operations to justify an invasion. Apparently, there was a foiled plot that the United States, through its intelligence services, discovered where Russia was going to basically accuse Ukrainian soldiers of firing upon them on the border, and that would be justifiable reason for them to cross and start fighting. Now, to be fair, as an American, the United States has a very long history of staging reasons to get involved in conflicts. You know, the Gulf of Tonkin is a perfect example of this. Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destructions that never existed are a very good example of this. Now, President Biden and other world leaders have been trying to talk this down, right? Trying to talk Russia out of invading, getting their troops back, and just not really escalating anything any further. Literally none of this has worked so far. Even threatening them with sanctions has not worked. Russia continues to build up thousands of soldiers per week on the borders. They're staging military exercises, right? But America has made it very clear that they support Ukraine and that they will also be able to increase their support to Ukraine. In fact, the United States actually just sent or ordered 3,000 soldiers to Poland. So it's not like the United States is pulling completely out of the area and backing down. No, America is bolstering its support for the region. They are adding more soldiers in neighboring countries. And of course, NATO is probably devising a plan right now to respond if all-out war breaks out, because that possibility is still distinctly possible. Right now, de-escalating anything with Putin has not worked. It doesn't appear that it's going to work. They seem just hell-bent on this happening. So at this point, my personal take, I do think Ukraine's about to get invaded. I don't see Russia not invading them. There's literally no purpose in building up this amount of military force on the border and then just pulling back. Like, you don't need to scare Ukraine like that. You don't need to threaten, global stability like that if you have no intentions of actually doing something. They don't seem to care too much about negotiations. They kind of want the West to bow down to them. They want NATO to back up. They don't want Ukraine to join NATO. But the United States and NATO have made it very clear that they still have an open door policy. Any country that wants to join the alliance is free to join the alliance, and that still includes Ukraine. If they want to join NATO, and at this point, why wouldn't they? They're free to, and the United States is not going to stop them from joining. And if Ukraine were to join NATO, all that does is bolster probably already the strongest military force on the planet in terms of an alliance even further, and that probably would escalate to an all-out war at that point, because as NATO stands, if a member nation is attacked, all of the other member nations come to their defense militarily. So it would be kind of dangerous for Ukraine to join NATO, because Russia, is already hell-bent on invading now. Can you imagine if they did join NATO and actually upset them more? But at the end of the day, I do think the invasion's going to happen, and I do think Ukraine and Russia will be at war. Do I think, I guess, the United States, do I think they'll be at war anytime soon? Hopefully not. I would really prefer if we weren't. I kind of enjoyed the 6 months of us not being in a global conflict that has existed in my entire lifetime at this point. So, but at the end of the day, Russia, what they're doing is inexcusable. It's not defensible. You can be scared, right? You can be not wanting NATO right on your front door, but they've been hostile. They've been hostile for years. They invaded Crimea in 2014 and took that shit, and they still occupy it to this day, and they see it as a piece of Russia. But Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Ukraine has the right to exist in a sovereign state, right? They are not a puppet of Russia. They do not have to be a puppet of Russia. They also don't have to be a puppet of NATO. I don't care. If Ukraine wants to say fuck NATO tomorrow and fuck Russia, cool. Exist on your own. That's fine with me. I don't feel the fucking need to care if Ukraine doesn't want our support, but obviously they do. And it's not hard to figure out why. Both sides at this point, they point the finger at the other one and say they're the aggressor, but at the same time, they both have done things that aggress on each other, and they both take it too far to a certain extent, right? It's not like the United States and NATO haven't been fucking with Russia for a long time, and is probably the number one actual threat to their sovereignty if any sort of conflict were to break out, but you can't just go around invading countries just because you fucking want to. And I know that sounds rich as an American, right? Because we're kind of known for being the invaders at this point, right? But most Americans, they don't really want military action all around the globe, Like, we'd rather, have highways get funded and, like, public transportation, like bullet trains and shit. I kind of want to be able to, like, go from San Francisco to New York on a train and it not be 200-year-old infrastructure. Kind of, want schools to be funded too, right? I want schools to be advanced, and I want American education to fucking flourish. I think that's a better use of my taxpayer money than fucking funding another war. But at the end of the day, I'm not the one who gets to make the decisions. So with that being said, is this the end of, or the beginning of World War III? Hopefully not. I don't think so, as long as everyone keeps a level head in this situation and no one really jumps the gun, primarily the West, because they're kind of waiting out what Russia's gonna do here. So if it kind of just stays to that point, hopefully not, but I mean, anything really can happen, man. It is definitely worrisome. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're brand new around here on the channel, follow me over on Twitter and Twitch at @subtooptimus. Make sure to check out Shop Opti down below. And until my next video, guys, this is Optimus, well, talking about World War III and signing out.